There is something ancient in the human fear of the sea. Not the waves, not the storms, not even the drowning, but the thought of what lives beneath. The darkness below the waterline, the weight of something vast and unknowable pressing up from the deep, patient as stone, old as the world itself. Every civilization that ever built a boat has looked out at the horizon and wondered, quietly, what looks back. The Norse people did not wonder quietly. They gave it a name. Jormungandr. Say it slowly, and it almost sounds like the ocean itself. A long, rolling sound that begins deep in the chest and fades into something barely audible. In Old Norse, the name translates with striking simplicity to the mighty serpent, or sometimes the great beast. Both translations are, if anything, an understatement, because Jormungandr was not merely a serpent, it was not merely a monster, it was a force of nature given form, a living boundary between the world of men and the end of everything. According to Norse mythology, Jormungandr was one of 3 children born of a union that should never have occurred, a pairing between Loki, the shape-shifting trickster god whose loyalties were always shifting like smoke in wind, and a giantess named Angrabotha, whose very name means she who brings grief. It was, by any measure, a doomed partnership, and from it came 3 of the most feared beings in all of Norse cosmology. Fenrir, the great wolf who would one day break his chains and devour the sun. Hel, the half-living, half-dead goddess who ruled over the realm of the dishonored dead. And Jormungandr, the serpent, the youngest, the quietest, the one that would outlast them all, right up until the very last moment. When the gods of Asgard learned of these 3 children, they were not welcoming. The All-Father Odin himself, who had seen the threads of fate woven by the Norns, understood what these offspring represented. He knew what they would one day do. And so, with the cold pragmatism of a god who has read the end of his own story, Odin acted. Fenrir was bound in enchanted chain. Hel was cast down to rule the underworld, and Jormungandr, the infant serpent, was hurled from the heavens and thrown into the ocean that encircled Midgard, the world of humankind. One can only imagine what that must have looked like to the Norse mind. A god, standing at the rim of creation, casting a creature into the black waters below, and the creature falling and disappearing into depths no light had ever reached. But here is where the story becomes something larger than a simple tale of exile. Because Jormungandr did not die in those waters. It did not starve. It did not weaken or diminish. It grew, year by year, century by century, millennium by millennium. The serpent coiled itself further and further around the ocean floor, feeding on whatever the darkness provided, and growing, always growing, until, at last, it had grown so immense, so impossibly, incomprehensibly large, that its body encircled the entirety of Midgard. Every coastline, every shore, the whole of the known world wrapped in the coils of a single creature. And in that position, curled around the earth like a ring, it bit down on its own tail. The Norse called this the Ouroboros posture, the world serpent consuming itself, holding the circle of existence closed. This image, a serpent encircling the world and swallowing its own tail, is one of the oldest symbols in human history. Cultures from Egypt to India to Greece all carried some version of it, but the Norse version carries a weight the others do not, because in their telling, the serpent is not a symbol of eternity or renewal. It is a clock. The moment Jormungandr releases its tail, the world ends. The seas will rise. The sky will tear. The age of gods will be over. It is, in other words, the one creature whose very existence is the only thing keeping existence alive, and whose death will unmake everything. This is the paradox at the heart of Jormungandr. It is a destroyer. It is also, in the most literal sense, a keeper of the world. The Norse people understood this tension well. They were a people who lived at the edge of the survivable world, in cold, in ice, in storms that could end a village before morning. They did not build myths to comfort themselves. They built myths to explain the truth of things. And the truth, as they understood it, was this: the same forces that could destroy you were often the same forces holding everything together. In the segments that follow, we will descend deeper into the story of Jormungandr. We will walk through its legendary encounters with Thor, the thunder god who could not leave it alone, and trace the long, inevitable arc toward Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods. We will explore how the serpent was depicted across centuries of Norse art, poetry, and stone carvings, and what those depictions tell us about the people who made them. We will examine the scholars and the sagas, the prose Edda and the poetic Edda, and the extraordinary care with which these stories were preserved through generations of oral tradition before they were ever written down. And at last, because no documentary about a world-ending serpent would be complete without it, we will ask the question that practical minds always arrive at, sooner or later. Could it have been killed not by gods, not in myth, but by men, by sailors, by the hardened, sun-scorched, powder-burned crew of a pirate ship at the height of the golden age of sail, armed with cannons, cutlasses, and the particular kind of fearlessness that only comes from having very little left to lose? But that question waits at the end of our journey. For now, let us go back to the beginning. Let us go back to the water. There are rivalries in mythology that feel inevitable, not chosen, not earned, but written. As if the universe itself required a particular tension to exist, and simply assigned it to two beings who had no say in the matter. The rivalry between Thor and Jormungandr is exactly that kind of thing. These two did not arrive at hatred gradually. They did not build a history of small grievances and escalating conflict, the way mortal enemies sometimes do. From the moment they first encountered each other, something older than either of them snapped into alignment. The Norse understood it as fate. The Norns, those three ancient weavers who sat at the roots of Yggdrasil, the world tree, spinning the threads of destiny, had already written their ending together. Every confrontation between the thunder god and the world serpent was not a new chapter. It was a rehearsal. A long, grinding, inevitable rehearsal for the moment at the end of the world when neither of them would walk away. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Let us begin where the stories begin. Of all the encounters between Thor and Jormungandr preserved in the Norse sagas, none is stranger or more quietly extraordinary than the story told in the prose Edda, the great 13th century collection of Norse mythological texts compiled by the Icelandic scholar Snorri Sturluson. It is a story of disguise, of humiliation, and of a moment so close to catastrophe that the gods themselves were left shaken by it. And it begins, of all places, at a dinner table. Thor, along with Loki and two human companions, arrived at the great hall of Loki, a king of the giants, a being of staggering size and, as it would turn out, staggering cunning. Loki welcomed them with the particular warmth of someone who already knows how the evening is going to end. He offered them food, rest, and a series of challenges, each one designed to humiliate his divine guests in front of his court. Thor, never one to decline a challenge, accepted. He was asked to lift a cat, just a cat, a grey, unremarkable animal sitting on the floor of the hall. The giants barely concealed their amusement. Thor, the strongest being in all the 9 worlds, the one who hurled his hammer, Mjolnir, across the sky and called it thunder, being asked to lift a cat. He reached down. He gripped the animal. He pulled with everything he had. Muscles that had bent iron and cracked mountain stones strained against the weight of a single, apparently ordinary animal. And he could not lift it, not completely. He managed, with every ounce of his legendary strength, to raise one paw off the floor. Just one. The hall erupted with laughter. Thor was furious. But Utgartha, Loki was not finished with him. Only later, when the deceptions had run their course and the giant king revealed his trickery, did the truth emerge. The cat had not been a cat at all. It had been Jormungandr, the world serpent itself, shape-shifted or illusioned into the form of a small animal, coiled impossibly into a mundane shape. And the reason Thor could not fully lift it was because Jormungandr's body encircled the entire world. To lift the cat completely off the ground would have been to lift Midgard itself. When Thor had managed to raise that one paw, just that single paw, Utgartha, Loki confessed that he had been genuinely terrified, that such a feat was barely comprehensible to him. The gods of Asgard, hearing this story later, were left deeply unsettled, not because Thor had failed, but because of how close he had come to succeeding. It is a remarkable scene when you sit with it, a story that begins as farce, a god embarrassed at a dinner party, and reveals itself as something cosmic. A reminder that the world serpent was not merely large, it was inseparable from the world itself. You could not move it without moving everything. But if that encounter was one of strange, almost accidental contact, then the second great confrontation between Thor and Jormungandr was something else entirely. It was deliberate, premeditated. It was Thor, bored and restless as he so often was, going looking for a fight. The setting was the sea. The method was fishing. Thor disguised himself as a young man and sought out the giant Hymir, a cold, unfriendly being who lived near the edge of the ocean and who owned a boat. Thor asked to come fishing. Hymir was unenthusiastic. Thor was persistent. Eventually they set out together, rowing far beyond the boundary of where Hymir was comfortable, out into the deep water where the light changed and the currents ran strange. Thor had brought his own bait, a detail the sagas include with a kind of casual specificity that makes it feel entirely real. He took the head of one of Hymir's great oxen, cut it free, and used it as bait on a hook of considerable size. This was not a man going fishing. This was a god going hunting. He cast the line into the deep, and Jormungandr took the bait. What happened next is described across multiple versions of the saga with varying levels of detail, but the core of it remains consistent. The line went taut. The boat lurched. Thor braced himself against the hull and pulled, and the serpent pulled back, and the contest between them was so violent, so absolute, that Thor's feet drove straight through the floor of the boat and found purchase on the ocean bed below. He stood on the seafloor in the middle of the ocean and hauled, and Jormungandr, the creature that encircled the world, rose toward the surface. For a moment, the saga tells us, they looked at each other. Thor, bleeding from the effort, hammer raised and ready, and the serpent, vast and poison-breathed, its eyes carrying something the texts struggle to describe. Not fear exactly, but recognition. The same recognition that registers between two things that have always known they will destroy each other. Thor drew his arm back to throw Mjolnir, and Hymir, terrified beyond reason, cut the fishing line. Jormungandr sank back into the deep. The moment passed. Thor, incandescent with rage, threw Hymir overboard and waded to shore. The sagas record that Jormungandr reached the seafloor again and has been there since. The near encounter had no victor, but it had a significance that the Norse took seriously, because in the cosmology of their world, every near miss between Thor and the serpent was a reminder that the true encounter, the real one, the final one, was still coming. It could not be avoided, only delayed. And in delaying it, these strange rehearsals were, perhaps, the only thing keeping the clock from running out. This dynamic tells us something profound about how the Norse constructed their mythology. Unlike many ancient traditions, theirs did not offer salvation. Their gods were not omnipotent. They could be tricked, exhausted, outmaneuvered, and ultimately defeated. The universe in which they lived was not a place that bent toward justice or order. It was a place that bent, inexorably, toward its own ending. And Jormungandr was the living embodiment of that truth. There is, if you read the sagas carefully, an almost melancholy quality to the way Thor pursues the serpent. He knows, at some level, because the Norse gods are never fully ignorant of their fate, that his final encounter with Jormungandr will kill him, that he will drive his hammer through the serpent's skull, and the serpent will already be dead when he takes his 9th step backward and falls. He knows this, and still he goes fishing. Still he accepts challenges in giant hauls. Still he looks for it. The Norse did not see this as stupidity or recklessness. They saw it as the only reasonable response to a world with a known ending. You do not sit still and wait for doom. You go out and meet it halfway again and again with your hammer raised. It is a philosophy built into the very bones of the Jormungandr myth. The serpent and the thunder god, circling each other through eternity, one holding the world together by gripping its own tail, the other making sure, every few generations, that the grip has not loosened. Two forces in perpetual terrible balance. And somewhere in the depths of a cold Norse sea, the balance held for a little while longer. There is a particular kind of heroism that does not involve weapons. It does not require strength or speed or the willingness to sail into unknown water. It requires something quieter and, in its own way, just as rare. The willingness to sit down in a cold room with ink and vellum and write things down before they disappear forever. To look at a living tradition and understand, with clear eyes, that it is dying. And to decide that it should not die without a record. This is the heroism of the scholars who preserved Jormungandr's story. And without them, we would not be here. We would have no fishing trip, no cat in a giant's hall, no image of the thunder god taking his 9 final steps. We would have smoke where the myth once was, a shape of something that used to be known, growing fainter with each generation until it dissolved entirely. That it did not dissolve is one of the quiet miracles of medieval literature. To understand how the stories of Jormungandr survived, we have to understand the world they came from, and the world that nearly swallowed them. The Norse mythological tradition was, for most of its history, an entirely oral one. It lived in the mouths of poets called skalds, who occupied a role in Viking society that was something between artist, historian, and priest. The skald was not merely an entertainer. In a world without written records, the skald was the record. They memorized genealogies, battle accounts, the deeds of kings, the stories of gods, and they carried all of it in their heads, reciting it at feasts and councils and funerals, passing it to apprentices who would carry it further. The tradition was extraordinarily sophisticated. Norse skaldic poetry operated under complex rules of meter, alliteration, and internal rhyme that made the verses difficult to compose but nearly impossible to forget once properly learned. The structure of the poetry was itself a memory device. The form was the vessel. For centuries this was enough. But then came Christianity. The conversion of Scandinavia to Christianity was not a single event. It was a long, uneven process that rolled across the region between roughly 900 and 1100 CE, moving at different speeds in different places, sometimes gentle and sometimes violent, but always permanent in the same direction. And with it came an entirely new relationship to the old stories. The gods of Asgard, Odin, Thor, Freya, Loki, were now either demons to be rejected or embarrassments to be quietly forgotten. The mythological framework that had organized Norse understanding of the cosmos for generations was officially wrong, and the skalds who had carried it were no longer priests. They were, at best, curiosities. At worst, something to be suppressed. The oral tradition did not die overnight. Traditions rarely do. But it began to fray. The apprenticeships grew shorter. The full mythological context that gave skaldic poetry its meaning began to erode, even as the poetry itself continued to be recited. By the 12th and 13th centuries, there were scholars in Iceland who could still quote the old verses, but who recognized with some alarm that the references within those verses were becoming opaque. People were losing the ability to understand what the poems were actually about. The mythology that held the poetry together was leaking away. Iceland was, in many ways, the last stronghold. Settled primarily by Norwegians in the 9th century, geographically remote from the centers of continental European Christian influence, Iceland had maintained a more robust relationship with the old traditions than most of Scandinavia. It was also, by the 13th century, developing a remarkable literary culture, one that would produce the sagas, those long, precise, almost novelistic accounts of Viking Age life that remain some of the most vivid historical literature of the medieval period. And it was in Iceland, in the early 13th century, that a man named Snorri Sturluson sat down and did something extraordinary. Snorri was, by any measure, a fascinating and complicated figure. He was a chieftain, a politician, a man of significant wealth and equally significant ambition. He was not, by the standards of his time, an obviously spiritual or reverent man. He was practical, strategic, and deeply interested in power, and yet he produced, somewhere around 1220 CE, a work called the Prose Edda, a comprehensive, structured retelling of Norse mythology that remains, to this day, the single most important source we have for the stories of the Norse gods. What makes Snorri's achievement remarkable is not just that he wrote the myths down. It is that he did so with the awareness of a man who understood he was working against time. He was a Christian, writing in a Christian society, about a pre-Christian mythology that his own world officially regarded as false. He justified his project partly on literary grounds. He wanted to preserve the skaldic tradition, to give future poets the context they needed to understand the old verses. But reading the Prose Edda carefully, you sense something else beneath the scholarly rationale. A genuine fascination, a respect for the architecture of the old stories that goes beyond mere academic preservation. Snorri did not simply transcribe. He organized, cross-referenced, and explained. He gave us the stories of Jormungandr with a clarity and narrative completeness that suggests he had access to a rich tradition, both written fragments and living oral sources, and that he synthesized them with real intelligence. The fishing trip, the hall of Utgartha Loki, the final battle at Ragnarok, the precise detail that Thor will walk exactly 9 steps after killing the serpent before the venom takes him. These specifics did not appear from nowhere. They came from a tradition that Snorri caught, just barely, before it slipped out of reach. But the Prose Edda was not the only net cast. The Poetic Edda is an older and in some ways more mysterious collection, a compilation of mythological and heroic poems preserved in a single Icelandic manuscript known as the Codex Radius, which was written down around 1270 CE, but which contains material scholars believed to be significantly older, some of it potentially dating back to the Viking Age itself. Unlike Snorri's organized, prose-framed retelling, the Poetic Edda is raw. It is the actual poetry, the verses that the skalds recited, preserved as close to their original form as the surviving manuscript tradition allows. Reading the Poetic Edda alongside the Prose Edda is a remarkable experience because the two texts illuminate each other. Where Snorri explains and contextualizes, the poems simply speak in the compressed, elusive, sometimes deliberately obscure language of skaldic verse, where a kenning like the encircler of the earth or the deep one's coils was enough to conjure Jormungandr for an audience that already knew the myth. In the Voluspa, the great prophetic poem that opens the Poetic Edda and describes the creation and eventual destruction of the world, The serpent appears at the edges of the narrative, like a tide coming in. You feel its presence before you see it. The poem circles around Ragnarok, the way Jormungandr itself circles Midgard, and when the end finally comes, it comes with terrible swiftness. These two texts, taken together, form the foundation of virtually everything we know about Jormungandr. Every subsequent retelling, every modern novel, every film, every academic paper on Norse mythology traces its lineage back to these manuscripts, copied by hand in cold Icelandic scriptoria, preserved through centuries of fires and wars and simple, indifferent time. It is worth pausing on that. The stories we have been telling in this documentary, the fishing trip, the cat, the poison breath, the 9 steps, exist because specific human beings in specific cold rooms made specific decisions to write them down. The preservation of mythology is never automatic. It is always chosen. And it is always chosen by individuals who understood that stories are not merely entertainment. They are the architecture of a people's understanding of themselves and their world. For the Norse, Jormungandr was not just a monster story. It was a cosmological statement. It was a way of saying, the world is bounded, there are limits to what exists, and something holds those limits in place, and that something is dangerous beyond comprehension, and it will not hold forever. This was not pessimism, it was honesty. The Norse mythological tradition is, among other things, one of the most unflinching acknowledgments in all of ancient literature that good things end, that strength fades, that even gods die, and that the appropriate response to this truth is not despair, but engagement. Full, committed, eyes open engagement with the life you have, while the serpent still holds its tail. The scholars who preserved this tradition understood, even if they did not always articulate it in these terms, that they were preserving something irreplaceable, not because the old gods were true or because the myths were history, but because the way a people tells its stories reveals something essential about the way that people understood existence. To lose the story of Jormungandr would have been to lose a particular kind of human wisdom, a hard-won, sea-forged, frost-tempered way of looking at a world that does not promise you anything. We did not lose it, thanks to Snorri, thanks to the anonymous compilers of the Codex Regius, thanks to the monks and scribes and scholars whose names we often do not even know, who copied manuscripts because someone told them it mattered, and who turned out to be right. The serpent still circles the world in the pages of those texts, patient as it has always been, waiting. Words are fragile things. They exist in the mouths of people, and when those people are gone, the words go with them unless someone has thought to write them down. And even written words are vulnerable to fire, to flood, to the slow patience of decay working through vellum and ink across the centuries. We have already seen how narrowly the literary tradition of Jormungandr escaped that fate, how close the whole vast architecture of Norse mythology came to dissolving into silence. But there is another kind of record, one that does not require ink or vellum or a cold scriptorium or a scholar with the foresight to preserve what others were content to let go. It requires only stone. And the Norse, as it happens, were extraordinarily good at stone. Long before Snorri Sturluson was born, long before the Codex Regius was compiled, long before Christianity arrived to complicate the relationship between the living and their gods, the image of Jormungandr was already being carved into rock faces, into the faces of standing stones, into the prows of ships, the hilts of swords, the frames of doorways, the surfaces of jewelry small enough to hold in a closed fist. The serpent wound its way through Norse material culture with the same relentless consistency that it wound its way around Midgard itself. Everywhere you looked, if you knew what you were seeing, there it was. To understand why, you have to understand something about how the Norse related to their mythology, not as a set of stories heard occasionally and enjoyed at a distance, but as a living framework woven into the fabric of daily existence. The gods were not remote. They were present. Odin moved through the world in disguise. Thor's hammer was in the thunder overhead, and Jormungandr, the great encircler, was in the sea that surrounded everything. Every fishing boat that pushed off from a Norse shore did so with the knowledge, held in the back of the mind like a stone in a shoe, that something beneath the water was incomprehensibly large and old and aware. When you carry that knowledge daily, you carve it. You make it visible. You put it on the things around you, partly as acknowledgement and partly as a kind of negotiation, a way of saying, I see you. I know you are there. Representation was not merely artistic expression for the Norse. It was a form of relationship. The oldest surviving visual representations of what scholars believe to be Jormungandr, or, at minimum, of the great encircling serpent motif central to Norse cosmology, appear in the runestone tradition. Runestones were large, upright slabs of rock, typically erected as memorials to the dead or as markers of significant events, inscribed with runic text and decorated with carved imagery. Sweden alone contains thousands of them. Norway, Denmark, and the British Isles have hundreds more. They are one of the most remarkable archaeological inheritances the Viking Age left behind. An outdoor gallery of stone spread across a landscape, legible to anyone who takes the time to learn the visual language, and that visual language is serpentine almost by default. The decorative style most commonly associated with runestones is what art historians call the urn style, named after the extraordinarily beautiful carved wooden portal of the Ørnes Stave Church in Norway, which dates to approximately 170 CE. The Ørnes style is characterized by long, sinuous animal forms, serpents and dragons, primarily, that interweave and bite at each other in compositions of flowing, almost mathematical elegance. To the modern eye, trained on centuries of subsequent decorative traditions, it can look almost abstract, but to the Norse eye, it was deeply specific. Those intertwining forms were not generic decoration. They were cosmological statements, every serpent eating its own tail, every creature locked in combat with another, every endless interlocking loop was a visual echo of the same great truth. The world is held together by forces in perpetual tension, and that tension is not a problem. It is the mechanism. Jormungandr appears most explicitly in a remarkable series of carved images associated with the Thor myths. Among the most significant is the Altuna runestone, found in upland Sweden, which depicts what is almost certainly the scene of Thor's fishing trip with the giant Hymir. The carving shows a figure, broad-shouldered, clearly powerful, seated in a boat with a fishing line descending into the water below, where a great serpentine form rises toward the hook. It is a spare, almost minimalist image by modern standards, but in its context, surrounded by runic inscription and set against the open Swedish landscape, it carries an enormous weight. This is a community saying, we know this story, we carry it, it belongs to us. The Altuna stone was not erected for tourists or scholars. It was erected for the people who lived around it, who would pass it regularly and recognize what they saw, and feel, perhaps, the complicated mixture of pride and dread that the image of Thor and the serpent was always meant to evoke. A similar scene appears on the Hardum stone from Denmark, and in various forms across the broader corpus of Viking Age carved imagery in Britain, particularly in the areas of heavy Norse settlement that historians group under the term the Danelaw, the region of northern and eastern England that was under Norse political and cultural influence from the late 9th century onward. The presence of Jormungandr imagery in England is a reminder that Norse mythology traveled with the Norse people. It was not rooted to a particular landscape. It moved across the sea in long ships, and it put down roots wherever those ships landed. and the people aboard decided to stay. Perhaps the most evocative category of Jormungandr's material presence, however, is not the monumental, the runestones and church portals, but the personal, the small, wearable, holdable objects that Norse men and women carried on their bodies and kept in their homes. Among the most common finds in Norse archaeological contexts are small metal amulets in the form of Mjolnir, Thor's hammer. But alongside them, with striking frequency, appear serpent forms, rings and pendants and decorative clasps in which a serpent consumes its own tail, the Ouroboros posture that the Norse associated directly with Jormungandr and with the bounded nature of the world. What does it mean to wear the image of the creature that will end the world around your neck? It is a question that stops modern observers more than it would have stopped. A Norse woman clasping a serpent ring at her throat before going about her day. For us, raised in traditions that associate apocalyptic imagery with fear and warning, the impulse is to read the symbol as ominous. But that reading misses something fundamental about the Norse relationship to Jormungandr and to the end of things in general. The serpent eating its tail was not a warning. It was a reassurance. It meant the circle was still closed, the grip was still held. Whatever chaos lay beyond the edges of the world had not yet broken through. The amulet was not a reminder of doom. It was a reminder that doom had not yet come, and that for now, in this moment, the serpent still held. There is a quiet comfort in that, once you understand it, and it tells us something important about the people who wore these things. They were not naive. They did not live in ignorance of suffering or impermanence. Norse life in the Viking Age was hard in ways that are genuinely difficult to reconstruct imaginatively from the distance of centuries. Winters of authentic severity, seas that killed routinely, violence that was a normal feature of political life rather than an aberration. These were people who understood loss. And their response to that understanding was not to look away from the symbols of ending, but to wear them, to keep them close, to make them beautiful. The craftsmanship of Norse serpent imagery is, in itself, worth dwelling on. These were not crude scratches made by people working in haste or fear. The interlaced patterns of the Erna style represent an artistic tradition of genuine sophistication, compositions that require planning, precision, and a deep internalized sense of how form flows into form. The serpents on the great runestones are carved with a fluency that suggests artists who had spent years, perhaps lifetimes, learning to render these creatures in stone. There is love in the work, not love for destruction, but love for the image. An aesthetic delight in the sinuous line, the interlocking curve, the way a serpent's body can fill a space with a sense of both confinement and endless motion simultaneously. This is what Jormungandr gave Norse visual culture that no other mythological figure quite replicated, a formal problem of extraordinary richness. How do you represent infinity? How do you carve boundlessness in bounded stone? The answer the Norse arrived at, again and again, was the same. You draw a serpent swallowing its own tail, and you make the line as beautiful as you possibly can, and you trust that anyone who sees it will understand what it means. Not in words, not in doctrine, but in the way that certain images bypass explanation entirely and speak directly to something older and quieter in the human mind. We still respond to it. Centuries after the last true believer in the Norse gods has gone, the image of the world encircling serpent retains its power. It appears in modern jewelry, in tattoo art, in the visual language of heavy metal album covers and fantasy novel illustrations and video games. It has migrated through time with the same stubborn vitality that Jormungandr itself displayed in the myth. Cast away, submerged, expected to disappear, and yet somehow always still there. The stone remembers what the voice forgets, and the image outlasts the explanation. Somewhere in a Swedish field, the Altuna stone still stands. The fishing line still descends into the carved water below. The great serpent still rises toward the hook. And if you put your hand against the stone on a cold morning, you can feel, very faintly, the texture of the carving under your fingers, the outline of something enormous, something old, something that has not let go. Every story, if it is honest, has an ending, not a resolution, not necessarily a triumph or a redemption or a moment where the threads pull together into something clean and satisfying. Just an ending, a place where the thing that was set in motion finally arrives at its destination, and the world on the other side of that arrival looks nothing like the world before it. The Norse knew their ending. They had always known it. It was not hidden from them, not sealed in prophecy, that only the initiated could access. It was common knowledge, spoken at firesides, encoded in the poetry the skalds recited, carved into the stones that lined the roads and marked the graves. The gods would die, the world would burn and flood. And then, after a silence that the texts do not dwell on because there are no words adequate to it, something new would rise from the water. They called it Ragnarök, and at the center of it, releasing everything that had been held in place, was Jormungandr. The word itself, Ragnarök, has been subject to centuries of linguistic debate, but the most widely accepted translation renders it as something close to the fate of the gods, or the doom of the divine powers. Some scholars have argued for Twilight of the Gods, a translation made famous largely through Wagner's operatic cycle, and now so embedded in popular culture that it is difficult to dislodge, even for those who know better. But fate is the more precise word. Because Ragnarök in the Norse conception was not something that happened to the gods unexpectedly, it was something that happened to them on schedule. They knew it was coming. They had known for an age. And the tragedy, the particular, aching Norse quality of the tragedy, is that knowing changed nothing. The sequence of events leading to Ragnarök is described with remarkable consistency across the surviving sources. It begins not with battle, but with winter. A winter unlike any that has come before. 3 consecutive winters without a summer between them, a period the texts call Fimbulwinter, the Great Winter, during which the sun gives almost no warmth, crops fail across the world, and the bonds of human society begin to dissolve. Brothers turn on brothers. The structures of kinship and obligation that hold communities together fray and snap. The world grows cold, not just in temperature, but in every way that matters. During Fimbulwinter, the chains that bind Fenrir, Thor's wolf sibling, to Jormungandr, begin to weaken. The great wolf strains against his enchanted fetters, and in the depths of the sea, something stirs. Jormungandr, who has held its own tail in its teeth since Odin cast it into the ocean at the beginning of the age, begins to move. The coils that encircle Midgard shift and tighten, and then, in the moment that the Norse mythological tradition has been building towards since the first word of the first story, release, the serpent lets go. The seas respond immediately and catastrophically. The Völuspá describes the ocean rising as Jormungandr writhes toward land, the waters breaking over the shores of Midgard in waves that swallow the coastlines whole. The great ship Naglfar, built from the uncut fingernails and toenails of the dead, a detail so specific and strange that it lodges permanently in the imagination, breaks free of its moorings, and sets sail with an army of the dead aboard. The sky begins to split. Heimdall, the watchman of the gods, sounds the Galahorn, and its note carries across all 9 worlds. The gods arm themselves. They have been waiting for this. They have always been waiting for this. And Jormungandr comes ashore. The image deserves a moment of genuine consideration because it is one of the most staggering things the Norse mythological imagination produced. A creature so large that its body encircles the entire world, dragging itself out of the ocean and moving across the land. Breathing poison, the texts tell us. its venom spreading across the sky in clouds that darken the air itself. The prose Edda specifies that, as the serpent advances, it sprays poison across the earth and heavens, contaminating the air, making the very atmosphere toxic to anything that breathes. This is not a monster arriving at a village. This is a natural disaster that happens to have a face. Thor meets it. Of course he does. The outcome was written before either of them existed, but Thor meets it nonetheless. Because that is what Thor does, and because doing anything else would have required him to be something other than what he was. He strides out to face the serpent with Mjolnir in his hand, and the battle between them is described in the surviving texts with a terseness that somehow makes it more devastating than elaborate description would. This is not the fishing trip where there was tension and near miss and the cutting of a line to forestall the inevitable. This is the inevitable, arrived at last. The rehearsals are over. Thor kills Jormungandr. He drives his hammer into the serpent's skull with the full and terrible force of everything he is. And the world serpent, the creature that has circled the earth since before human memory, that held the boundary of Midgard closed with its own body, that came within a hair's breadth of being lifted entirely off the seafloor by a god pretending to lift a cat, dies. And then Thor takes 9 steps backward, away from the fallen body of the serpent, while the venom that Jormungandr breathed across the battlefield works through him. 9 steps are all he manages. On the 9th, the thunder god falls. The texts record no final words, no dramatic last gesture. He falls, and the thunder that has been a presence in the Norse sky for as long as the Norse sky has existed goes quiet. 9 steps. It is such a specific number that scholars have spent considerable energy analyzing it. 9 is a number of deep significance throughout Norse cosmology. There are 9 worlds on the world tree. Odin hung on Yggdrasil for 9 days and nights to gain the knowledge of the runes. There are 9 mothers attributed to Heimdall. 9 is a complete number in the Norse symbolic framework. A number of fullness, of things done entirely. Thor's 9 steps are not arbitrary. They are a statement that what he did was complete, that he went as far as it was possible to go, that nothing was left undone or unfinished. There is an extraordinary mercy in that detail, if you look at it from a certain angle. The serpent killed him, but he died having done what he came to do, having gone the full distance. 9 steps is not failure. 9 steps in this mythology is everything. The Völuspá does not linger on the deaths. It moves through Ragnarok with the same measured, relentless pace that the events themselves carry. Odin swallowed by Fenrir, the sun going dark, the stars falling from the sky, the earth sinking into the sea. And then, after what feels like a long silence in the text, a remarkable thing. The earth rises again, green and renewed from the water. The surviving gods find each other, a man and a woman, sheltered through the destruction in the branches of Yggdrasil, emerge to repopulate the world. A new sun, the daughter of the old one, takes her mother's place in the sky. Ragnarok was not, in the end, simply an apocalypse. It was a transition, a turning. The old world, held in shape by the coils of a great serpent, had to release before the new world could begin. Jormungandr's grip on its own tail was, in the deepest reading of the myth, not just a barrier against chaos. It was also a barrier against renewal. The same creature that kept Midgard intact was the creature whose release allowed something better to emerge. This is the final, most profound paradox of Jormungandr's place in Norse mythology. It was the destroyer, it was the preserver, and it was, in a sense that the Norse understood intuitively, even if they rarely stated it plainly, necessary. A world that never ends cannot be replaced by something better. The The serpent holding its tail was the world holding itself in place. And at some point, every world must let go. The Norse did not fear this. Or rather, they feared it the way you fear a winter that you know will eventually end. With full knowledge of the cold, with full knowledge of the dark, and with a patience built from generations of understanding that the things which seem most permanent are always, on a long enough scale of time, the things most certainly passing. Jormungandr let go. The seas rose. The thunder went quiet after 9 steps, and the earth, when it came back up from the water, was green. We have spent considerable time in the world of myth. We have walked through the cold cosmology of the Norse, sat with their scholars, run our fingers across their carved stones, and watched, at a respectful distance, as a thunder god took his 9 final steps. It has been, in the truest sense, a journey through one of the most sophisticated mythological traditions the human mind has ever produced. But now we are going to do something different. We are going to think practically, because every generation that encounters Jormungandr eventually arrives at the same question, usually late at night, usually with the particular quality of focus that arrives when the imagination has been thoroughly engaged and refuses to simply switch off. The question is not theological. It is not literary. It is almost embarrassingly straightforward. Could you kill it? Not a god. Not Thor with his enchanted hammer forged in the heart of a dying star by dwarven craftsmen of supernatural ability. A person. A crew of persons. Men and women of flesh and gunpowder and rope and iron, working with what they had in the world they actually inhabited. We are going to set our theoretical reckoning at the height of the golden age of piracy, roughly 1680 to 1730 CE. This is a deliberate choice. By this period, naval technology had reached a point of genuine lethality. The sailing ship had been refined over centuries into a weapons platform of considerable sophistication. Gunpowder artillery had matured from crude, unreliable early cannon into standardized naval armament capable of delivering devastating broadside fire. And the men who crewed the ships of this era, particularly the pirates and privateers who operated outside the formal constraints of naval discipline, were among the most practically experienced, improvisationally capable maritime fighters in human history. If any mortals were going to attempt this, it was them. But before we can discuss strategy, we need to establish the problem. And the problem, stated plainly, is almost beyond rational engagement. Jormungandr encircles the world. Let us sit with that for a moment as a physical fact rather than a poetic one. The circumference of the Earth at the equator is approximately 40,075 kilometers. Jormungandr's body, in the mythological tradition, wraps around the entirety of Midgard with enough length remaining to bite its own tail. This means the creature's body is, at minimum, 40,000 kilometers long. For reference, the largest animal that has ever existed on Earth, the blue whale, reaches lengths of approximately 30 meters. Jormungandr is not in the same category of measurement. It is not even in the same category of concept. The blue whale is to Jormungandr what a grain of sand is to a mountain range. The body diameter matters too. A creature of this length, scaled proportionally to known serpent anatomy, even generously compressed to allow for the theological requirements of ocean living, would have a body diameter in the range of several kilometers at minimum. The head, which in serpent anatomy is typically broader than the body, would be larger still. We are describing, in physical terms, something closer to a geological feature than an animal, a living mountain range that moves. This is the enemy. These are the terms. Now, what did a Golden Age pirate ship actually have to work with? The most formidable pirate vessels of the era were typically converted merchant ships or captured naval vessels. three-masted square-rigged ships capable of carrying between 20 and 40 cannon, crewed by anywhere from 80 to 300 men depending on the vessel's size and the captain's recruiting success. The cannon of this period fired iron round shot, solid spherical projectiles typically ranging from 6 to 32 pounds in weight, with an effective range of roughly 400 meters for accurate fire, and a maximum range approaching 1,000 meters for plunging shots aimed at high angles. The penetrating power of a 32-pound round shot against timber was formidable. Against flesh, even very large flesh, it was devastating. Against a creature whose scales, if we are reasoning from the mythological tradition, which describes Jormungandr as essentially impervious to everything except the specific divine circumstances of Ragnarok, are of unknown, but presumably extraordinary durability. The 32-pound round shot presents its first serious problem. We do not know what Jormungandr's hide is made of. The sagas do not give us a material specification, but we can reason from the tradition. This is a creature that has lived on the ocean floor since before human civilization began, under pressures that would crush any known biological material. It has survived temperatures ranging from near boiling at hydrothermal vents to the near freezing of the deep ocean trenches. It is, in the cosmological framework of Norse mythology, a being of divine origin, the offspring of a god, however compromised, which places it in a category of physical durability well beyond the merely biological. The honest assessment is this: a 32-pound iron cannonball fired at close range into the flank of Jormungandr would almost certainly do nothing meaningful. The ratio of projectile to target is so extreme as to render the comparison almost meaningless. Firing a cannonball at Jormungandr would be, proportionally speaking, roughly equivalent to firing a grain of sand at a blue whale. The grain of sand does not kill the whale. The whale does not notice the grain of sand. So standard naval artillery is, in all probability, insufficient. But pirate captains did not survive by accepting the first answer they were given. Let us think differently. Let us think the way a genuinely creative, genuinely desperate pirate captain, someone like Bartholomew Roberts or Edward Teach, or the fictional archetype of the best of them, might think when presented with a problem that conventional weapons cannot solve. The first strategic observation is this: Jormungandr has a specific anatomy. It has eyes. It has a mouth. It has, presumably, internal structures, throat, digestive system, organs of some kind, that are meaningfully less armored than its exterior hide. This is true of virtually every living creature, regardless of external protection. The vulnerability, if one exists at all, is interior. This opens a tactical avenue that is unconventional but not entirely absurd: delivery of a payload inside the creature rather than against it. The golden age of piracy coincided with the mature use of fire ships, vessels loaded with combustible or explosive material, and sailed or drifted into an enemy fleet to cause fire and chaos. The concept was well understood and had been used to devastating effect in naval warfare for centuries, most famously against the Spanish Armada in 1588. A fire ship loaded with gunpowder, black powder barrels, pitch, tar, and any other available incendiary material sailed directly into the open mouth of Jormungandr during a feeding event or aggressive approach, and detonated. This represents the most credible theoretical attack vector available to a pirate crew of the era. Would it work? The honest answer is, probably not fatally. But possibly not nothing either. A large powder magazine detonation, the kind achieved by loading an entire ship's worth of gunpowder stores into a concentrated space, produces an explosion of considerable violence. The destruction of the Spanish flagship Nuestra Señora de la Concepción in 1681, caused by a powder magazine accident, was described by witnesses as an explosion visible and audible from miles away, producing a shockwave that damaged nearby vessels. scaled up to a deliberately maximized fireship. Every barrel of powder, every combustible material available, stripped from multiple captured prizes and concentrated in a single hull. The detonation inside the throat or stomach of even a supernaturally large creature represents at least a theoretical source of internal trauma. The problem, of course, is getting the ship there. Jormungandr is not a passive target. The mythological tradition is consistent on the creature's awareness, its aggression when provoked, and the almost supernatural challenge of approaching it. The venom it projects, described in the sagas as capable of poisoning the sky itself, would present a lethal atmospheric hazard to any crew attempting close approach. The Golden Age pirate had no protection against airborne toxins of divine origin. The crew of the fireship would, in all probability, be dead before they could complete their approach, which leads to the most practical tactical innovation available to a pirate captain of this era: the unmanned fireship, rigged with a delayed fuse, slow match, burning at a known rate across a known length, giving a calculable time delay. A fireship could theoretically be aimed, locked on course with its rudder lashed, and ignited before the crew abandoned it upwind at a safe distance. The venom hazard would still be extreme. The wind direction would need to be precisely right. The timing would need to be perfect in ways that combat almost never permits. But it is not impossible. It is merely nearly impossible. Let us be honest about the final accounting, because this exercise deserves an honest conclusion. A single pirate ship cannot kill Jormungandr. 10 pirate ships cannot kill Jormungandr, even the full assembled might of the Golden Age. Every pirate and privateer and naval vessel operating in the Caribbean and the Atlantic simultaneously, coordinated in a way that the fractious, individualistic culture of piracy would never in reality permit, faces a target so cosmologically large that conventional military thinking simply dissolves against it. But here is what that assembled fleet could do. It could make the attempt. It could load every fireship it possessed with every pound of powder available. It could find the head, a structure, remember, that is still kilometers across, a target impossible to miss even for the navigators of an era before GPS. It could exploit the one anatomical vulnerability the mythology implicitly acknowledges: the interior. It could light the fuses, lash the rudders, and send every fireship it had into that vast and ancient mouth, while the remaining crews watched from upwind distance and waited to see what the fire did in the dark. Would it work? No, almost certainly not. Jormungandr is not a thing that mortal hands were ever meant to end. The Norse were clear on this. The creature belonged to a scale of existence that placed it beyond the reach of human agency by design. But here is the thing about pirates, the thing that made them pirates in the first place. They were not particularly interested in what they were meant to do. They would have tried anyway. They would have loaded the ships, said whatever passed for a prayer among men who had largely made their peace with God and the devil both, and sailed towards something the size of the horizon with fire in the hold and nothing left to lose. And that attempt, that gloriously, catastrophically human attempt, would have been, in its own way, a worthy echo of the tradition they were sailing into. Thor knew he would die. He went anyway. 9 steps. That is all any of us ever get in the end. 9 steps in the direction of the thing we cannot defeat, taken with everything we have, until we fall. The serpent holds its tail. The circle remains closed. And somewhere in the deep water, something vast and patient waits for the moment, the one moment written before the world began, when it finally lets go.